7 or 8 years ago, gimbals were everywhere. Your phone stabilization was terrible, your mirrorless camera wasn't any better, and putting either one on a gimbal was the fastest way to make your footage instantly look more professional. But then phones combined optical image stabilization with amazing EIS. Mirrorless cameras got 5-axis IBIS that made handheld shooting viable. And the gimbal suddenly went from a must-have to something you'd only see at weddings and other paid shoots. Except for one camera. The exception is of course the DJI Osmo Pocket 3, but most people didn't buy it because they specifically wanted a gimbal. The gimbal just happened to come with it, and when you look at why people actually recommend it over a smartphone, the gimbal usually isn't even the main selling point. Instead, it's things like the dedicated camera experience, the bigger sensor, the expandable storage, even just the fact that people react differently to being filmed by it compared to a phone. None of that is really about the gimbal itself. Which raises the question, why does a gimbal still belong on a pocket camera today? After all, DJI is doubling down on it with the Pocket 4, and Insta360 is building its new Lunar around one too. To answer that properly, we have to first look at the trade-offs, because a gimbal isn't just a nice extra feature you can otherwise ignore, it comes with some very real drawbacks. The Osmo Pocket 3 has a mechanical gimbal sticking out of it, and that changes everything about how you carry it, protect it, and use it day to day. Take pocketability. Yes, the Osmo Pocket 3 technically fits in your pocket, but you're not just tossing it in there like you would a phone or an action camera. You've got this exposed gimbal head that always feels a bit vulnerable, so in practice you often keep it in a bag or use a protective case, which isn't quite the same as just sliding it into your pocket. Then there's weather resistance. The gimbal means the Pocket 3 has none. That makes it less dependable as an all situations camera, which just isn't a problem for flagship smartphones or action cameras that can handle a splash. And from a shooting standpoint, the gimbal can often work against you. Recording is no longer a simple point and shoot exercise. You have to stay aware of which gimbal mode you're in, perhaps use the joystick to adjust the tilt, and occasionally recenter it when things go wrong. So right off the bat, the gimbal is costing you pocketability, weather resistance, and ease of use. If you just wanted a simple point and shoot to replace your phone, those are some heavy compromises. Now this of course doesn't mean a gimbal doesn't belong on a pocket camera. It just means it has to justify itself. So let's get into the actual benefits. The first is that the gimbal is not just a stabilization system. Even if you completely set stabilization aside, there are a number of bonus perks to having a camera with a motorized panning and tilting head. It means the Pocket 3 can do things like follow you automatically with subject tracking, mount the camera where you want and re-aim the camera without having to physically move things around, shoot motion time-lapses with smooth programmed camera movement, and flip into selfie shooting with a tap of a button. Getting all of that from a smartphone usually means stepping up to a much bulkier setup. Now realistically, not everyone is going to need all those features or use them all the time, but it's definitely worth recognizing that a huge part of a gimbal's value is that it gives your camera a much wider creative toolkit. The second advantage of having a gimbal, and one of the main reasons people buy one in the first place, is that it raises the quality floor for handheld shooting. In this example, I'm doing the same pan with both the Osmo Pocket 3 and my iPhone. The iPhone's built-in stabilization still does a good job of removing any unwanted shake, but the Pocket 3 footage looks much more controlled and cinematic because the gimbal is slowing and smoothing out the movement itself rather than just correcting for it. In general, I found it easier to get better looking pans on the Osmo Pocket 3 than trying to do things without any gimbal assistance. And it also takes care of things like horizon leveling, which is a common weak point in a lot of my iPhone footage where the frame can end up slightly tilted without me noticing. So overall, the Pocket 3 reduces operator burden. You don't need to be quite as skilled or quite as locked in to get a polished result, and that really matters in run and gun situations. Now maybe at this point you're thinking, sure, those are some nice extras, but I don't really need tracking, motion time lapses, or any of that stuff. And if smoother handheld footage mostly comes down to technique, why not just get better at shooting without a gimbal? And that is a fair point, but this is where we get into some of the more underrated advantages of a gimbal. First, less cropping. Digital stabilization almost always works by cropping into the image and using that extra room as a buffer to smooth things out. The trade-off is that you're throwing away part of the frame in exchange for stability. Take the iPhone for example. When I record footage in the native app, this is what I end up with. And when I record in the Blackmagic camera app and turn off stabilization, this is what I end up with instead. When you compare the two, you can see just how much of the image is being reserved for digital stabilization. So even though the iPhone does have optical sensor shift stabilization, it's clear that EIS is still doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And that means a level of crop that a gimbal camera like the Pocket 3 simply doesn't need. The next underrated benefit is low light performance. A lot of people credit the Pocket 3's low light advantage entirely to the larger sensor, but the gimbal is a big part of the story too. In low light, cameras often slow down the shutter speed to let in more light, but when you combine digital stabilization with slow shutter speeds, that's when nasty stabilization artifacts start to show up. To show you what I'm talking about, let's look at some nighttime biking footage I took. Here on the Osmo Action 5 Pro, you can see obvious ghosting and jittering in nighttime footage. By comparison, the iPhone's main camera produces an image with much better detail and less noise, but when we actually play the footage back, we're still seeing those nasty EIS artifacts. It's only on the Osmo Pocket 3, which uses physical stabilization with the gimbal instead of relying on EIS, that the footage stays clean and natural. And that leads us to the final benefit of having a gimbal, which is closely tied to the previous point. A gimbal lets you use ND filters with far fewer compromises. ND filters can give your footage a more cinematic look by letting you lower the shutter speed and introduce natural motion blur, the kind of motion blur we associate with film and television productions. The problem is that on cameras relying heavily on digital processing, that slower shutter can bring back the same ghosting and artifacting we just talked about. This is most obvious on action cameras because they rely solely on electronic image stabilization and apply it most aggressively. But even on an iPhone, if you use a third-party app to lock in a slower shutter speed, you'll still see weird artifacting that just doesn't show up when you're shooting with a faster shutter. So in a world where phones and other compact cameras now offer stabilization that's honestly good enough for most people, does a physical gimbal still belong on a pocket-sized camera? I think the answer is definitely yes. Because beyond basic smoothing, that little mechanical head is what saves you from the digital crop tax, keeps your low light footage clean and artifact free, and unlocks a creative toolkit that other cameras simply don't have out of the box. Of course, there are big trade-offs as mentioned earlier. You're giving up weather resistance, true pocketability, and a bit of simplicity. But when you add it all up, the gimbal really is earning its place, especially for people who care about getting the best possible image quality out of a camera and who'd rather not rely so heavily on digital processing magic to get there.